MotoGP is an amazing sport. Riders lay their lives on the line, racing against each other at 220 miles an hour, taking corners at speeds that 90% of people will never experience, much less while racing against other riders. All of this just for the shot at finishing faster than their opponents. There's plenty of things that make a sport like this unique. But if I had to pick the biggest one...
What? Here's what happened there then. Oh my god! Oh my god!
The crash. A singular moment in time when everything goes wrong. It doesn't matter where you are on the track, how far into a race you are, or how good you're doing. One momentary loss of concentration, a fraction of a second of lost traction, and it's all over. The crash is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're the greatest rider of all time. If you don't finish the race, you can't finish first. Crashes are also undeniably one of the biggest spectacles in the sport. Nobody wants to see a rider get hurt, I hope, but there is something undeniably intriguing about the idea of the crash that attracts fans to crash compilations on YouTube like moths to a flame. But I have some questions. Who crashes the most? Who crashes the least? Which tracks have the most crashes? Is Marc Marquez really the dirtiest rider of all time? There was only one logical way to answer this. Watch every single crash of the MotoGP era and categorize them in this giant spreadsheet. Did I say logical? I meant completely insane. This was insane, and it didn't start like this. Originally, I just wanted to see how this year's crash count compared to last year's crash count, and then I got this comment. And I just had to know. Before we get into the breakdown of what I found, we have to lay out some ground rules and talk about my methods, because if we don't understand the baseline that I've set, how are the results going to make any sense? That being said, if you don't really care about this, I get it. Skip to this time, and that's when all the data analysis is going to start. Alright, now that all the losers are gone and it's just us cool kids who care about research methodology, let's get into it. First, what is a crash? Is this a crash? Is this a crash? What about this? This is definitely a crash. Now, most people probably agree that these two things aren't crashes and these two are. But why? If we're going to be looking at every crash, we need a strict definition that we can look back at. In the end, I settled on this. A crash is any time the rider and any part of the bike excluding the wheels come into contact with the ground and stop. This eliminates runoffs and hard contact as the bike stays up. Basically, if it looks like a crash, it is a crash. Second, let's run through the types of crashes. I identified 7 conditions that made a crash noteworthy in my opinion that I wanted to track. The easiest one to understand is a second crash. This is simply a second crash which occurs in a race where a rider has already crashed once. Next is a crash out of the lead. This one is relatively simple. Any crash where the rider was holding the frontmost position on the track when they crashed. I decided to count crashes where a rider made a move for the lead that resulted in a crash moments later on these as well, as they did still technically crash out of the leading position even if it wasn't a sustained lead. Next is the high side. The high side is a crash in which the bike suddenly straightens up, leading the rider to be forced off the high side of the bike. These crashes are usually much more dramatic and dangerous than its low side counterpart, and as such, I decided to mark them. Now, I also chose to keep track of a more specific type of high side that you may have never heard of called the top side. If you've never heard of it, I don't blame you. I'm taking this terminology from a scientific paper about the injury rates from crashes in MotoGP. In the paper, a topside is defined as a crash in which the motorcycle suddenly decelerates relative to the rider, who is propelled over the handlebars. This is by far the rarest of the main types of crashes and also the most dangerous. It typically doesn't occur without outside help, as usually it is when the bike hits a foreign object on the track, or the brake lever is suddenly depressed, which not many riders will willingly just slam their brakes. Finally, the last 3 crash types all have to do with collisions. The first is the takeout, and this will probably be the most controversial definition I have. My definition of a takeout is any action taken by a rider which leads to one or more riders crashing, intentional or otherwise. This is the highest level of motorcycle racing, and if your action leads to a crash, you should be held accountable for that in my opinion. If it was unclear to me which rider caused a crash, I looked for either a statement from the rider, a ruling from the stewards or race direction, and usually I went with the rider who made the first move in the inciting incident. Based on a poll from you guys, which even if you cause a ton of riders to crash, it should only count as causing 1 crash as opposed to 1 crash for everyone involved. A subcategory of this is a caused crash where the rider stays standing. These will not count towards a rider's crash total as they themselves did not crash, but it will count towards a rider's caused crash total as they did cause the crash. Fairly straightforward. Finally, on the other side of the takeout, the taken-out crash. This is a crash where a rider is on the receiving end of a caused crash, taken out of the race by another rider. Okay, so now that we know the categories, what was my sample size? Well, I chose to look at all MotoGP races. Why just races? Well, prior to a certain point, qualifying and practice sessions are not readily available on MotoGP's Video Pass. I could have used MotoGP's annual crash report for this, but that doesn't have the categorizations I wanted and would therefore contaminate the data. Plus, this was more meant to be about the races anyway. Those are the crashes that matter most, the ones that affect the points directly. Secondly, why only back to 2002? Well, that's the time when race reports are readily available. We'll talk about why race reports are so important in just a second, but just know that without them, I can't possibly be accurate in my data gathering. Finally, why just MotoGP? Why not the smaller classes? There were 1,514 crashes that I had to catalog for this. I did all of those by hand. I posted this poll when I started working on this video. I like to at least pretend that I have a life, and doing the other two categories would have made this miserable. Finally, one last thing before I get into it, how did I actually do this? And what are the sources of error? So in terms of how, MotoGP puts out a race report at the end of every race. It looks like this, and it conveniently has every crash from that session listed out. Handy. I used this as a guide and searched for every crash listed in the replay of the race, and then categorized them. There are two main sources of error here. The first is inaccurate race reports. I have found inaccurate race reports in the past, which left things off. Second is backmarkers. Backmarkers don't make the broadcast very much, and thus their crashes are harder to categorize as they aren't usually on camera or even shown in replays if they weren't that significant. If I came across a crash like this, I left it as a simple crash with no category. But if there was seemingly a multiple rider incident, I would turn to Google and try and find a third-party report on the race and see if there was any data, and I don't think there was ever one where I wasn't able to conclusively determine who caused the accident. And there is, of course, another type of error, that being human error. I'm not perfect. In the course of editing this video, I have found at least 3 times where I mislabeled a crash, got something wrong, so don't take this as gospel. This is just my personal project. It hasn't been double-checked by anyone. I'm not trying to present it as the indisputable, irrefutable truth. I am positive I've gotten some things wrong. This is just meant to be something to be enjoyed. Phew, okay, thank you so much for bearing with me. That took a little longer than I thought, but we're finally ready to talk about the data. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Who crashes the most? Well, let's look at this chart to find out. This is every rider who's ever started a race since 2002. By my count, 159 entrants. The horizontal axis is your total number of Grand Prix starts, the further right, the more starts you had, and the vertical axis is your number of crashes. The line in the middle is a rough estimation of the average for a rider at that number of starts. If you're below the line, you're doing pretty good. If you're above the line, you crash more than usual. The further above the line, the more concerned you should be. I want to take a look at some of these guys. First, let's take a peek at the biggest outlier on the chart. This guy way out here. You may have heard his name, and if you like MotoGP statistics, you probably already know who this is. Valentino Rossi. As he always does when you try and graph his stats, he completely changes the way this chart looks. He is also way below the average line. You actually can't even see where it's really supposed to be. He started 372 Premier Class races and crashed 36 times. Enough to place as 5th of all time in total crashes, but actually not that bad when you consider just how long he raced for. What about the rest of the top 5? Well, in 4th we have Rossi's most famous rival. Marc Marquez has started 189 Grands Prix at the time of recording, and has crashed out of 41 races. That puts him here on the graph, well above the line, but compared to the rest of the top 5, not really that bad. In 3rd, we have Aleix Espargaro, the rider who is currently 3rd all-time for career starts, and he is also 3rd in crashes, currently having 254 starts and 45 crashes to his name. Finally, the 2 dots that probably jump out at you right away. Well, these dots are none other than Jack Miller, with 46 crashes across 175 race starts, and the most crashing rider in MotoGP history, with Cal Crutchlow, 48 crashes across 179 career starts. The British rider holds the dishonor of the most crashes in the MotoGP era, and honestly, this made a lot of sense when I first saw it. If you go back and rewatch the races from Crutchlow's time in the Premier Class, you do see him crash out quite a bit. One thing that may jump out at you is that these are all good riders. That makes a lot of sense. You need a lot of starts to even get this many crashes, and nobody's going to employ someone who crashes out all the time. These riders being here sort of all make sense. So let's take a look at some of the other outliers on this graph. First, This group over here, all riders with over 100 starts who are well below the trend line. Who are they? Well, first we had Tony Elias, who had 105 career starts and in that time only had 11 race crashes. That's pretty damn good. Next up is a rider who surprised me, Hector Barbera. Barbera was a pretty decent rider, but that's about it. He raced for 8 years in the MotoGP class and never found a podium. He doesn't get much screen time, and perhaps one of the reasons he was able to stay in the Premier class for so long despite having only one championship top 10 in 8 years was the fact that he almost never crashed, only logging 12 crashes across 139 starts. Finally, the rider other than Rossi who is the furthest below the trend line on the graph, Colin Edwards. Edwards is one of the last American riders to make waves in the Premier class and currently holds the record for the most Premier class starts without a win. But he also rarely crashed, only crashing 15 times across just under 200 Premier class starts. That's pretty incredible. Interestingly, there's another group of riders that kind of mirrors this one on the other side of the graph. Riders with just under 100 career starts who all have crash counts well above the ones seen from Edwards. The first of these is Marco Bezzecchi. Bez has logged 20 crashes across 59 weekends. But I want to put a pause on this because as we'll see later, there's something else going into this number. The next rider here is a little further right and a lot further up. This is Alex Marquez. Alex Marquez is currently at 88 weekends and 27 crashes. Finally, all the way up here, almost a mirror of Colin Edwards, is Joan Mir. Mir is 6th all time on the crashes list, with 35 crashes across just under 100 Grand Prix starts. One important note is that these are all current riders. This is important since the x-axis is specifically Grand Prix starts, which is the stat that MotoGP counts for your starts, meaning current riders in the sprint era have about 1.5 times as much time in each weekend to get a crash logged, and you can much more easily log 2 crashes in a weekend. That being said, any current fan can tell you that Mir being up here is no surprise, as the Honda rider is dealing with one of the most unrideable machines the modern era has ever seen. Alright, here's a slightly different graph that shows similar data. This one shows crash percentage on the y-axis and total starts on the x-axis. This kind of shows what I was talking about earlier. Most riders who crash a lot simply don't have long careers. We can see a lot of the riders we've talked about already on here. There's Joan Mir, Cal Crutchlow, and Andrea Dovizioso, and of course Rossi way on the right as per usual. But who's this dot way up here? Well, that's rookie Pedro Acosta. As a rider who has only raced in the sprint era, he falls victim to the sprint races increasing a chance of a crash or 2 crashes per start. But until MotoGP begins counting sprints and start totals, I'm going to keep the system like this for now, leaving Acosta with a crash rate of 47% across all starts. But if you think that's a cop-out, I understand. In that case, the crashingest full-time rider becomes Sam Lowes, who crashed out of 7 of his 18 MotoGP starts during the 2017 season, leaving him with a crash rate of 39%. One of my first questions when I was starting this project was, has anyone ever crashed out of every single race they started? And the answer is yes. Let me introduce you to Kota Nozane. Nozane is a multi-talented rider, finishing 3rd in the 2016-17 FIM Endurance World Championship, and has been the champion in the All Japan Road Race Championship and the Japan JSP 1000 Championship. He started his only MotoGP race in 2017. His home race at Motegi. He rode as a replacement rider for Jonas Folger, and despite breaking his hand in FP3, still made his way to the start line on Saturday for the wet race. His race would come to a quick end with 20 laps to go, as he lost the front and slid out, retiring from the race in an inspired effort, honestly. But the fact that he was even willing to race with a broken hand in the rain is a testament to his grit. This is a great showing from Nozane. What about the other side of the coin? Has anyone never crashed? Well, yeah. Actually, a lot of people. In fact, a whopping 39 riders have started races and never crashed. Granted, most of these riders were replacements and one-offs, but there were 4 riders who really rose above the rest, racing the majority of races in at least one season and never once crashing. These riders were Nicolo Canepa, who started 14 races as a full-time rider for Ducati in 2003, only logging a single retirement for a technical problem in Indianapolis. The next rider, with the second highest start count without a crash, is Brock Parks, who, interestingly enough, was Kota Nozane's teammate on that 2017 endurance team. Small world. Parks competed for Paul Bird Motorsport in 2015. Competing in all 18 rounds that season and logging one more start at the Valencian Grand Prix the following year for Aprilia. But by far the rider with the most starts without a crash is Curtis Roberts, logging 22 race starts across 3 seasons without a single crash. But, yeah, that record isn't pretty. Yeah, I checked. Amazingly, all of these retirements are from technical issues. None of them are crashes. Curtis is often seen as the black sheep of the Roberts family, not being as successful in Grand Prix racing as his father or brother, but he at least has this record to his name. All of these retirements aren't really satisfying. You know whose career is satisfying? Ryuichi Kiyonari's. Kiyonari was called in to replace Daijiro Kato after his fatal accident in 2003, and would race in 13 races that season, and won the following year, and would never log a single retirement. Not even once did he fail to finish a race, crash or otherwise. But just crashing isn't everything. Sometimes it's about how you crash. Highsides are some of the most viewed MotoGP clips on YouTube. Let's take a look at the most prolific highsiders in MotoGP history. Here's every rider who's logged a highside placed on a graph. The x-axis is total crashes and the y-axis is total highsides. Up here, we have the most dramatic crashers in MotoGP. 5 riders who have logged 5 or more highsides across all their races. Up here we have Loris Capirossi, Danilo Petrucci, Randy DePugny, and Danny Pedrosa. But above them all, we have the only rider to log 7 career highsides in races, Jorge Lorenzo. By far the most dramatic crasher in MotoGP history.
Is it up once again on Dovizioso? Simoncelli is over yet.
I'm just down here now.
Oh, massive moment! Now up for the series of right. Oh, the big. Let's have a look. Oh, what's a big crash for Jorge. To the front of Lorenzo's gone down and turn 1. He's high side at the first corner. What a disaster for Jorge Lorenzo.
Let's briefly talk about the topside. It's by far the rarest type of crash and arguably the most spectacular to watch. Only 8 of them across 1,514 total crashes. The riders here were Maverick Vinales, Aleix Espargaro, Alvaro Bautista, Sete Gibernau, Fabio Quartararo, Jose Luis Cardoso, Norick Abe, and Nicky Hayden. Now you might be saying, wait, I'm pretty sure I remember this happening to Enea Bastianini, and you're half right. Bastianini did have a topside crash, but it was on the warm-up lap on the way to the starting grid, so I chose not to count it. But it does have to go down as one of the most ridiculous crashes ever. But the way or intensity with which you crash isn't the only type of dramatic crash either. There's also the number of riders involved. I counted 3 crashes where 5 or more riders went down. Let's take a look at each of them. The most recent of these incidents happened at the 2023 Catalan Grand Prix in the very first corner. Factory Ducati's Enea Bastianini would make contact with Pramac Ducati's Johan Zarco, and the resulting pileup would take out both Gresini Ducati riders. At this time, that was Alex Marquez and Fabio Di Gianantonio, as well as VR46 Ducati rider Marco Bezzecchi. You may have noticed that all of these riders have one thing in common. Yes, somehow this incident only took out Ducati riders. In another unrelated incident moments later, Pecco Bagnaia would be thrown into the middle of the track and have his legs run over. This was a really scary crash. This looks like it could have ended his career. Fortunately, his injuries weren't actually all that severe, and he would go on to win the championship. The remaining incidents both involve 6 riders crashing. I'll talk about the older one first. It was another first corner crash, and this time at the 2004 Japanese Grand Prix. Into the first corner, Loris Capirossi would lose the rear, and his bike would collide with that of John Hopkins, sending both riders flying and sending their bikes into the path of the grid, causing Kenny Roberts Jr., Nicky Hayden, Max Biaggi, and Colin Edwards to crash out as well. This race was amazingly not red flagged, and Hopkins suffered 2 broken ribs. Roberts Jr. was left with a dislocated elbow and burns on his right side. But probably the biggest incident in the MotoGP class came at the 2006 Catalan Grand Prix. Another first corner Catalunya incident, this one happened before the riders even tipped their bikes into the curve, as Sete Gibernau would clip teammate Loris Capirossi's bike, an action which resulted in his front brake lever becoming fully depressed, locking his front tire and sending him into a nasty topside crash which would take out Danny Pedrosa. Meanwhile, Capirossi was jostled by the contact and would hit Marco Melandri, taking them both out as well. Shinya Nakano and Randy DePugny would be forced into the gravel where they would both fall as well. There is another kind of spectacular crash though, and that is the crash out of the lead. I talked about some of the worst chokes in MotoGP history on this channel already, but who chokes the most? Jorge Martin and Francesco Bagnaia have both become infamous for this in recent years, having 5 chokes apiece. The same as Jorge Lorenzo, and these are the highest levels of choking in history, except for one man. A man who dwarfs the second place record of 5 chokes with a massive 8. That man, the king of the choke, is Marc Marquez. Although most riders would probably do anything to have a 1 lead losing crash to 1 championship ratio. That's pretty solid. Now, this video is all about crashes, but what about when riders don't crash? How many races have there been where not a single rider crashed? Well, there's been 29 races since 2002 where not a single rider crashed. Frankly, that's way more than I was expecting. What's even more impressive is that there have been 4 races with 0 crashes or 0 retirements. 4 races where everyone who started finished. Those races were the 2024 German Sprint, the 2011 German Grand Prix, the 2008 Valencian Grand Prix, and the 2008 Indianapolis Grand Prix. Although this race was stopped short and cancelled due to wind, so really it's just 2 full-length Grands Prix here. There were also 2 times in history where there were 3 Grands Prix in a row with no crashes. Once in 2003 from the Czech Republic until Rio, and once in 2007 between Australia and Valencia. In addition, Valencia had its own hat trick of crashless races. From 2007 to 2009, no riders crashed during the Valencian Grand Prix. Pretty amazing stuff. However, if we look at the number of crashes that each track has seen, Valencia is relatively middle of the road, averaging 3.83 crashes per Grand Prix held there, which puts it in 8th among tracks since 2002. The safest track on average was Istanbul, averaging just 1.67 crashes across 3 Grands Prix. The least crashing track currently on the calendar is Phillip Island, with just 2.1 crashes per Grand Prix. Although if you count the 2025 reserve track Boud, it barely beats that out with 2 crashes. The most crash-prone track since 2002 was Suzuka, with a stunning average of 7 crashes per Grand Prix, although it was of course taken off the calendar after the fatal crash of Daijiro Kato in 2003. The only other tracks averaging 5 or more crashes per Grand Prix are both still on the calendar, and they are Mandalika and Portimao. On average though, most tracks are hovering right around the 3 to 4 crashes per race range, which feels right. Instead of geography, let's go by chronology. How have crashes changed over time? Well, here's the total number of crashes each year over time. Obviously, that huge spike near the end is due to the introduction of sprint races, so let's really quickly just get rid of those. There we go. Now we can see more accurately how crashes have changed over time. Interestingly, we see that crashes started high and wouldn't go back to those heights for nearly a decade. Instead, they would steadily go down until a pronounced dip took place in 2007 and crashes stayed stable through 2010, with 2007 and 2009 tied for the lowest crash count of the MotoGP era at 36 each. This happens to coincide with the time frame of the 800cc era, although the final year of the 800s, 2011, saw a spike to 60 crashes, becoming the year with the most crashes up to that point in the MotoGP era. Crashes would dip for a couple more years before sharply rising to 74 in 2015, and they would stay relatively stable, never going above or below 10 from 74, with the sole exception of the 2020 shortened season. Which brings up an interesting point. Seasons have been getting progressively longer, so it's possible the rise in crashes comes from the larger sample size of races in recent years. Well, that's what I thought, but here's the average number of crashes per year. This chart looks almost exactly the same. Sure, 2020 is leveled out now, which makes sense, and 2019 now has a huge spike, but other than that, the graphs look relatively the same, meaning that the number of crashes has gone up, regardless of the number of races. Alright, now it's time for what I'm sure many of you have been waiting for. Who is really the dirtiest MotoGP rider of all time? But before we answer that definitively, who's the unluckiest rider? Who gets taken out the most? Well, in terms of sheer numbers, it's a two-way tie. Johan Zarco and Miguel Oliveira have both been taken out 8 times. By percentage, it's a rider named Akira Yanagawa, who started 4 races and was taken out once, meaning he was taken out of 25% of all MotoGP races he started. But of course that's not the answer you're looking for. 66 riders have been taken out, and of those riders, 62 of them have been taken out between 1 and 6% of weekends. One of the others is the aforementioned Miguel Oliveira, taken out in 9% of race weekends. And the other is Marco Bezzecchi. Bezzecchi has started 59 Grands Prix and has been taken out 5 times, giving him a takeout rate of just over 8%. This is what I meant earlier when I said that we should take a pause on Marco Bezzecchi, because while he does have 20 crashes in 59 races, 6 of them were caused by someone else, meaning that his real total is probably a lot closer to average. But who are the cleanest riders? The riders who've raced the most and caused the least trouble? Well, there's 2 main candidates in my opinion. One is Nicky Hayden, who started 215 races and caused 0 crashes, by far the most for a rider who has never caused a crash. The other candidate, in my opinion, is Andrea Dovizioso, who started 248 crashes, the second most of all time at the time of writing this, and only caused a single crash. This one. Which one is better? I don't know. You tell me. Okay, finally, is Marc Marquez the dirtiest rider of all time? Well, it depends. People's definitions of dirty riding are wildly different. Some people believe any touching between riders is unacceptable, and some believe that rubbing is racing and there's no limit short of purposely punting someone else off a bike. So we're going strictly off number of crashes caused, and our eyes may tell us different things. But in terms of just how many crashes a rider caused, according to my rules, let's take a look. Here's every rider graphed by crashes caused and races started. Way down here we have Dovizioso and Hayden, well below average, but what we're really interested in are the guys up here. Here's the dot that probably jumped out to you at first, and as per usual, it's Valentino Rossi. He has the most crashes ever caused, with a total of 7 by my count, but they came over 378 races, which is way more than anyone else and really isn't that bad compared to some of the others on this list. But if all you care about is volume or pushing an agenda, then there you go. Valentino Rossi is the dirtiest rider of all time. I'm sure that soundbite won't come back to haunt me. Unsurprisingly, the statistical dirtiest rider is another non-full-time rider anomaly. Yuki Takahashi started 7 races and caused 1 crash, taking out Nicky Hayden at the 2009 Japanese Grand Prix. No other rider has a rate of 1 crash caused per 7 races, but that's not a satisfying answer. Our eyes tell us that the riders up here are much more interesting. So let's have a look. Tied for second in total crashes caused, we have Jack Miller and Johan Zarco with 6 apiece, although Zarco's have come in much fewer Grand Prix starts. Remember, someone who is further left is considered a dirtier rider, as they have achieved the number of crashes in significantly less time. The rest of this top group all have 5 crashes caused on their record. In order from most to least starts, we have Marc Marquez, Alvaro Bautista, Alex Marquez, and by the numbers, the full-time rider with the fewest starts per crash caused, Jorge Martin, having caused 5 crashes in just 74 Grand Prix starts, making Jorge Martin the statistical dirtiest rider on our list, with a rate of 14.8 starts per crash caused. It is at this point that I should mention that, technically speaking, by my own rules, Marco Simoncelli should be considered the dirtiest rider, because technically speaking, his fatal accident did cause someone else to crash, which would give him 3 crashes. That would make him statistically the full-time rider with the lowest ratio of starts to crashes caused, but that makes me feel like a bad person, and I don't like saying that. So just take that however. I'm going to say it's Jorge Martin, because I don't like how that makes me feel inside. If we look at the total amount of times a rider has been involved in crashes with another rider, regardless of who caused it, we can see some interesting patterns. Down here we have riders who were only involved in 1 or 2 incidents throughout their career, and as we move up we can start to see some more diversity. Amazingly, Casey Stoner only had 2 multi-rider incidents in his whole career. Andrea Iannone and Marco Simoncelli are the highest on the list to have exclusively taken out others, not having ever been taken out themselves. Moving up, we have a lot of modern riders, which makes sense given they do about 40 races per year, more opportunity for crashes. There's Marco Bezzecchi, and further up, Nicky Hayden, who's the highest rider on the list to have never taken someone out, although he himself was taken out a ton. But at the top, we have 2 riders who stand out above all others, Valentino Rossi and Johan Zarco. With 15 multi-rider incidents to his name, the Frenchman is the most likely to get involved with another rider on any given day. Almost every accident in MotoGP is special. They all contributed to the story of a season in one way or another. These moments can define weekends, seasons, even entire careers. And in the end, they are a major part of the spectacle that is MotoGP. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I want to give a special shout out to my channel members Sean, I think that's how you pronounce it, I don't know, Venturian CRO, and MVP2112. You guys are the biggest supporters of the channel, and my heart goes out to you. Thank you so much. Always remember to submit your MotoGP predictor times, and have a fantastic day.